Welcome to the Dark Zone, an adventure racing podcast.
It has felt increasingly like an art project of sorts, one that we really put our hearts and souls into. We put an awful lot of attention to the smallest details. You know, like I spend tens of hours just working on bibs, right? Both the design of the bibs and the communication with bibs. And, you know, it's an amazing amount of kind of like detailed work. And
okay, you people sit tight, hold the fort, and keep the home fires burning. And if we're not back by dawn, call the president.
You're going the wrong way!
What?
You're going the wrong way!
He says we're going the wrong way.
Oh, he's drunk. How would he know where we're going?
Yeah, how would he know? Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Welcome, listener, to Dark Zone number 76. As you may remember, we spent some time at Rootstock Racing's The Endless Mountains back in June of 2023. Over the course of 5 days, we put out 5 episodes and tried to capture the entire race experience. Solid listens right there, folks, so feel free to jump back in the queue and check out those episodes. As a wrap-up activity, I speak with Brent and Abby, the RDs of Rootstock Racing. It's a deep dive. It's a long episode. We really get into the race itself, the planning, the volunteers, the racers, the stories that came out of it. And this is not only interesting for the race director, but also for the racer. You get a sense of what goes on behind the scenes. So enjoy the episode. We're on the cusp of getting on a plane and heading east, across the Atlantic Ocean to the Faroe Islands for the Nordic Islands Adventure Race. It's going to be a 168-hour barrel of fun for all of the 24 teams that are making it. The Dark Zone will be there racing. I'm also bringing my recorder, and who knows who I will have a chance to speak with. There will certainly be an episode on the other side of that race. Thank you, everyone, for being a Dark Zone listener. The podcast continues to grow over time. Listenership is up. People are enjoying the shows. The whole goal is to bring content to the adventure racing community, and we are always open to your thoughts and ideas. Apologies to many folks who reached out to me. So much good content, only so much time. I have a whole bunch of episodes that are in the barrel that I want to get out, that are older, almost as far back as the winter and the fall. Such good people there. And I know that the line is long to have a chance to talk about adventure racing, and we are glad to have you here as a listener. So keep having fun out there, keep racing, and enjoy this episode of The Dark Zone. As always, thank you for being here. I'd like to also mention the Dark Zone's charity partner, Ascend Athletics. We are proud to support their mission to empower young women through mountaineering-based leadership training and community service. All of our listeners are encouraged to visit ascendathletics.org to learn more about Ascend and their work in helping to develop leadership and resiliency in young women in Pakistan and Afghanistan through fitness, mental health, community service, and mountaineering. Please note that Ascend pays nothing for this mention. We just love the work that they do and are happy to spread the word. Be sure to check out their website for some upcoming activities that anyone can get involved in. Welcome to the Dark Zone, an adventure racing podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. For those who've been listening to the last several episodes of the Dark Zone, you know that we embedded ourselves in the Endless Mountains Adventure Race, a 120-hour race over 5 days put on by Rootstock Racing out of Philadelphia. Our guests tonight are Abby Perkis and Brent Friedland, who are the race directors, founders, inventors, mad scientists behind the race itself. And I'm delighted to have them on the show. As listeners know, I was embedded in the race, and we had a chance to really bring you a lot of the coverage over the course of our podcasts, the 5 that we did there, alongside all the media that came out of it. And the vision for this episode of the Dark Zone is to give Abby and Brent a chance to talk out loud about the race itself and to sort of reveal to the world what goes into all the planning of a 120-hour race, the months and the weeks and the years that go into planning it, the people that are involved, the logistics. So Abby and Brent, we're very happy that you're here tonight. Thanks for coming on the Dark Zone. You've been frequent guests, and we're grateful that you're here with us.
Thanks for having us, Brian. We're excited to unpack with you.
Unpack, right? And that's a great word to use, because there's a lot in that suitcase. There's a lot that we did over the course of those 5 days and went into it. When the race begins, the one line in adventure racing is that the hardest thing to do is to get to the start line. You assemble all the gear, your teammates, you travel to the start line, you set everything up, and the race then begins. And I think that for a race director, especially for a 5-day race, 6-day race, 10-day race, whatever it is, that's that same exact feeling, but getting on steroids. Can you tell us a bit about what it took to get to the start line of the Endless Mountains? When did the planning begin? When did you begin to talk about it? When did you begin to scope it out? Brent, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, this year's race is the second in what we are tentatively expecting will be a 4 or 5 edition series of races in the Pennsylvania wilds. One of the original goals of the Endless Mountains, which is named after a region, a kind of an outdoor region of Pennsylvania, was to really showcase the entire 2 million acre region known as the Pennsylvania wilds. So in a sense, the planning for this began 3 years ago when we kind of started envisioning that. That said, for this year's race, we really started literally right after the 2022 event finished. As I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when we packed up in Clarion after the conclusion of 2022, did I drive home or?
You drove home. We had 2 cars out there, and we actually talked about the 2023 edition on the drive home. And then within days, Brent was in the woods looking at the course for 2023, and we can talk some about our scouting process and all that if that's relevant for you.
So clearly 2022 went well enough that you were so, if you will, such a high coming out of 2022 that 2023 was going to happen no matter what. Like you had that feeling right away. There wasn't even a thought about giving a break to it.
Not really. I think that, we had 32 teams at the start line in 2022, which is by international expedition racing norms, that's a respectable field of teams, if not maybe slightly bigger than average. So, from a kind of like a sustainability perspective, like we had the numbers. We very quickly we had a lot of really amazing feedback during the race. So I suppose if the race had really gone off the rails in some way, we may have chosen to kind of pack it in. But I think it went really well. So I think when the race finished, we kind of just started rolling into next year. I mean, the reality is we know that these races take an awful lot of planning. You can't just wait 3 or 4 months. At least we can't wait 3 or 4 months. I suppose one could. But, the quality of these events, I think, is really what you put into it. And it's not just the scouting. There's so many other layers that take so much time that really a year is required to, I think, really prep for one of these events, at least, again, to the standards we hold for ourselves.
Well, and the other piece of that I think is important to name is that the 2022 edition was a demonstration race in the Adventure Racing World Series. And from ARWS, there was an expectation that if the demo gear went well, we would run another edition, a full qualifying race the following year to kind of build on that momentum. And then we could slide into whatever schedule worked for our lives. So once we signed on with ARWS, that was kind of part of the expectation.
So let's give some background for the listener out there who ARWS is Adventure Racing World Series based out of South Africa. The CEO is Heidi Muller. There are races that are held around the world, and those races, there's demonstration races like Ozark this year was a demonstration race. And then if you do well there, you then become a full race, and winning the full race qualifies you for the World Championship.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the winners of the demonstration race do not get a slot for Worlds, but winners of a qualifying race do.
Gotcha. So you knew at the end of 2022, because you were trying out, if you will, for the larger picture for a world championship spot. 2023 was pretty much going to happen unless things completely fell apart. But
I felt like we knew that even before 2022 happened, right? Like once we kind of shook the proverbial hand with Heidi, or made the proverbial handshake with Heidi, that was part of the deal.
Gotcha. And 2022 was a success. Clarion was a great partner. I remember we've talked about it, hearing about how successful we were out there, but then it was time to go into 2023. And in many ways, it's like they say in the mob, you're as good as your last paycheck, right? And so as good as you do there, and as much as you do, your next race is a whole other high wire act that you go into. And to your point, Brent, it's much more than just the scouting, right? Anybody could go, well, I'm not saying anybody. Many people could go and could find beautiful places to bring other people. It's collecting, it's getting all the pieces in place, the sequence, everything going in one huge enterprise to get it going forward. Before we get into the course itself, before we talk about the actual race itself, can you both talk a bit about who you had a line up behind you in terms of the sponsors and the organizations and the towns and the lodging and the housing? Logistically, how do you get a race like this going? And think about the person sitting at home now who's an aspiring race director, who's doing well, who's doing 12, 24, 36-hour races and wants to expand it a little bit. Who did you have to get behind Rootstock Racing for this to be successful?
Yeah, so I'll start by highlighting three of the big ones that were kind of local to the region. So, there's different kinds of support, right? There's, financial support, which allows us to add some of the bells and whistles to the event, which helps us kind of make it more of the premier event we want it to be. There's also support that's a bit more in kind in nature, though not necessarily, gear in kind. But for example, one of the very first contacts I made in that week I went up there after the 2022 race, I swung by a little campground called the Crooked Creek Campground, which is up kind of along the Pine Creek in Gaines, Pennsylvania. And I actually popped in there largely to ask them to help me figure out where the rock site was, where we did our ropes work for this year's 23 course. I had learned that they did a little bit of guiding online. And I was having some trouble finding those rocks on my own. I thought they were somewhere where they weren't. So I stopped in really for that little bit of help. And one thing led to another. And we started talking to them about some in-kind support where they honestly helped me get through winter scouting by offering me a warm bed here and there. They of course did the ropes work for us. So that was a contracted agreement, but they were super helpful in setting up that entire section. And then again, supporting me on probably half a dozen or so scouting trips up there. So they were great. They also served as the host site for our light race. They kind of served as the headquarters and registration for that and the finish line for the light race. And were just wonderful the whole way around. Another one I would definitely want to shout out is Clinton County. So we have found over the last couple of years that, working with local county chambers of commerce have been very helpful and instrumental. They have different degrees of ability to actually help in like a traditional sponsorship way. But some of them are extremely helpful with contacts, and Clinton County turned out to be probably the most helpful partner we've had in 2 years of directing Endless Mountains and in our entire run as Rootstock Racing. So really instrumental in helping us get the right meetings with the right people, getting us contact information for private landowners when we needed it, being able to just answer quick questions that we had about things like road closures and construction, super helpful. And then one more was the Visit Potter Tioga County kind of Chamber of Commerce, who had a really great grant program. And that also, again, helped us be able to, invest in things like high-end bike jerseys and tech running shirts as additional swag on top of the buffs and t-shirts that we were going to do. Anyway,
so if I hear you correctly, you listed 4 basic components. There's a financial component where someone actually helps you out there. The other part is the in-kind, right, where a local vendor or business helps you out there. You mentioned working with a governmental agency that may have some sort of programs there, and obviously visitors bureaus. So really those 4, and not to be too granular to that, but that's literally you making a phone call, sending an email, doing some research. That's how uncomplex. That's how simple this entire process is.
Well, and I would add a 5th to that, which is logistics. And for us, we knew that Williamsport would be a good hub for this year's course geographically. It's also one of the bigger towns in the region. And so we needed to find, for example, a site that could host the racers. We needed to find a site that could host us for a banquet after the event. And we kind of had set this precedent from the previous year. We worked with Clarion University, which is now Penn West University, I believe. And that was such a hit with racers, right? Racers came in, they had a dorm room, what it lacked in amenities, it made up for by them being able to leave all their stuff in the room for the entire week. So it just like logistically, it was really streamlined. And then we worked with Clarion River Brewing last year as the finish line sponsor, but then also the post-race banquet. And so we replicated that in Williamsport, and we worked with Lycoming College and New Trail Brewing, both of whom ended up becoming incredibly supportive of the event in terms of in-kind donations. And Lycoming actually ended up giving us an unexpected discount on some of the spots at the university, which allowed us to get an additional food truck out on the course. So we were able to put that money back into the event and kind of give racers some added, as Brent said, some added bling for the experience.
Not to oversimplify, but this is almost like a little bit paint by numbers. Like 2 years in a row, right? Find a university that's empty come summertime. They might have summer programs, but they have room and board, right? They have food services, they have people there, they have the infrastructure in place, and then find a good local vendor. Clarion Brewing on one side, Neutral Brewing on the other, right? And I think that part of Pennsylvania, if you look hard enough, you find places like that. And Williamsport, to their credit, there were people in Williamsport that were incredibly supportive of the race, and they really showed up for you. And that's a larger town, and sometimes those towns are hard to work with. So to your credit, you were able to drill into those individual people that could help you out.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things I would just, I definitely want to highlight 2 or 3 other local partners since we're talking about them. I would also just say, to your point earlier, picking up the phone, it's, on one level, it is that easy, right? Whether it's a phone call or an email, or sometimes like it's stopping in, and that's not always the most comfortable thing to do. But sometimes it's literally when you're up there doing the field work, you drive somewhere and you take time out of the day that you'd rather spend in the woods finding checkpoints, and you stop in and you talk to somebody and you kind of cold call and ring a doorbell. I've literally done that with some private landowners, and yeah, so it's easy, but it also does take a fair bit of effort, and you do sometimes get rejected. You probably get rejected, or you don't get calls back more often than not. But yeah, a couple more that we just shout out. 2 more local ones: the Lumber Heritage Region and UPMC. Who are a big healthcare provider up in the region, were also super supportive of us in a more traditional way. They were stage sponsors, but a lot of positive energy, a lot of excitement about the event. Lumber Heritage Region, one of their representatives, Jennifer, who I was in contact with throughout the year, came out to the race and stopped in for a few hours up at Transition Area 2 and just had a great time. That was true of also Julie Brennan from Clinton County. She came out to the course and, got a look at things there. MRS, we definitely want to give a special shout out to them. They are possibly I think our only returning sponsor. Last year, our sponsorship and partnerships were really based in the kind of southern part of the region. And this year, it ended up being a whole new slate of partners. But micro rafting, MRS, they have been with us for both years. So they also a great stage sponsor. Their boats are amazing. More and more adventure racers are really kind of discarding their old boats and getting into MRS boats. And then also the Penwells Hotel in Wellsboro. Again, just super excited, super supportive. I think they let you set up shop there all night on the first night of the race to do that amazing first podcast you did with all the racers. I guess technically it's the second podcast of the series, but just a lot of positive energy there too.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. And adventure racing is one of the more complex things is actually explaining the sport to people. Right. There is no 30-second elevator pitch. But once people find out about what a race is and what people are doing, I find that they feel magnetized to it, that they think that this is that they're seeing in many ways, average citizen racers out there slugging it out with the course and really doing it. And so when you find the right people, like micro rafting, I believe the owner of micro rafting made it a point to come to the race, him and his family. He was like a little kid running around and taking the pictures and trying the boats out. And so in one way, people are pulled into the world of adventure racing. Coming back a bit granular, and I'm glad you went through all the different people that worked with you. You mentioned the idea of a stage sponsor. What does that mean?
Yeah, so when we set up kind of our partnership deck, we created different tiers of sponsorship. And one of those tiers is to sponsor an individual stage or leg of the race. And what that means is your name becomes attached to that stage. So for example, stage A presented by Micro Rafting or MRS, which was the case for this year's event. And it's a really nice way to highlight a relevant entity during that part of the race. So, Lumber Heritage, for example, was the stage sponsor for this kind of deep woods part of the event. And Trail Brewing was the stage sponsor for the last leg when folks were coming back into Williamsport. And it's a neat way to kind of pair up these really wonderful networks of support with the parts of the course where they are most relevant.
And the race offered live tracking. And I think the live tracking was sponsored by, was it UPMC?
That's exactly right. University of Pittsburgh Medical Center.
Right. And so that's another thing for race directors to consider, that not only are you going, it's not as simple as the fact that, hi, we'll put your name on our T-shirt, you give us some either in-kind or financial contribution, but instead you could actually get involved in the granular nature of the race by having a part of the race named after you and put on there. And I think that's a good thing to point out, because aligning all of those separate sponsors into one cohesive group allows you to do more, because you had, how many food trucks did you have on the course for the race?
We had 2 food trucks that came out, and both of them we were able to cover the cost of versus the racers having to pay for. Gotcha.
So on one hand, there's this formula in place where a sponsor will come along, will assist you in some way, then that is then funneled back into give the racer a better experience.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I would just add another highlight, since you're asking these, like you said, granular questions, but for the aspiring race directors, right? One of our goals in going out and kind of working hard to get people on board in some kind of partnership role is, as we've said, to be able to offer some of these extra amenities, whether it's better swag or being able to pay for 2 full food trucks over the course of the event. Or another thing this year that was really wonderful that we could leverage some of this support toward was really filling out our media team, right? So we had 3 full still photographers with Nick Winia, Vlad Bacalo, and Randy Erickson. We had a full videographer, Scott McGrath. Jeff O'Connor was on call both before the race to help us put together the really, really great flyovers and stage videos. And then unfortunately, he got quite sick just before the race and was not able to really be part of the media team during the race. But luckily, we had our teammate, Paul Miller, who was part of the race last year as well, in a media sense, but much more in a volunteer capacity. And we were able to, kind of have him shift over and not just do video work, but end up doing some really tremendous editing. So we were able to stick to our plan to release daily videos, which was what Jeff was going to be working on as well during the race. So it ended up being quite a robust media team. And without some of that great partnership, I don't think we would have been able to have the budget to do that.
And let's shout out the Dark Zone podcast too, which was there and I think it's important to say, Brian, in an entirely volunteer capacity. You came out because you are a fan of the sport and a presence in the sport, and we were incredibly grateful for your support out there.
I was going to say this at the very beginning, but since we're on it now, for the casual listener and for the sake of being transparent and all, right, I do think it's also worth noting that, Brian, you were also helping us behind the scenes throughout the year leading up to the race, and that was true last year too. You have played an instrumental role in helping us work toward these partnership arrangements and helping us kick the tires and, send those emails and work the phones and make those connections. And that's been a really huge help to us to have that. And you've also been a really great sounding board for a lot of ideas, whether it's related to T-shirt design or course design or whatever it might be. So
finish line,
right? That's a great one. Right?
Jim Murray, and thank you for your kind words. I appreciate that. And it's interesting. Absolutely. Like if you think about, you take me individually, but then you expand that back out. The level of commitment that people have to adventure racing is rather strong. Right, the people who hear the music loud. Right, they love it, and I think that all of the people that you've assembled to get involved in this, right? Because it takes a team to put all this together. I'm happy to play my role and thank you for your kind words. I think that it's predicated upon the idea that something inside those 120 hours, those 5 days, that amazing things happen to people. And people want to be a witness to it. So let's roll that back a little bit, right? And I appreciate the granular nature of the sponsorship and how you put that together and the in kind. But like just like an army runs on its stomach, a race runs on its volunteers. What was the volunteer core like for this race?
Oh my gosh, we had an embarrassment of riches when it came to volunteers. We had close to 35 people who came out either for the entire week or for parts of the week. And a number of those folks were returning from last year. So we had already built kind of that muscle memory and that rapport and that trust with each other. This was a more complicated race than last year. And I think in some ways, not in some ways, in all ways, a more logistically ambitious course, and maybe even more than we recognized as we were developing it. And the volunteers just stepped up in ways that were so I don't have the words for how.
What do you think that is?
Impact it was.
Like, why do you think like 35 people, right? And to varying degrees, some people were there the entire 5 days. People were there 6 days, 7 days. Some people were there for a day and a half because of the other commitments. What do you think it is about the sport and about rootstock racing and about the experience that people will give up a week of their time, either vacation time or they'll arrange their schedules to come and observe and play a role in what happened? What do you think they get in? Everything in life we do because we get something back out of it, right? That's human nature, right? What do you think it is that is returned to the volunteer that makes it worth their time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, with 35, call it 35 folks, there's obviously there's myriad reasons for that. I think one of the core reasons, and I'm going to focus on a certain subset of the volunteers, and these are the volunteers that I would say are kind of the ones that have the most experience around the sport, right? They're the people we would tend to put in charge of things if we can't be present. So I mean, I would love to take the time to name all 35 folks who came out. But I honestly, I don't want to miss anybody. So I'm not going to try to do that, but I can kind of probably highlight the small core group who were kind of the leadership folks, right? Greg Prouty, who's been racing and volunteering with us since the beginning in 2015. Jim Roundsley, special shout out to Jim Roundsley. He's from the UK and unbelievably experienced from working with the ITERA events over in the UK. He happened to be over here and reached out to us and said he wanted to help out. We know him from competing over in 5-day races in the UK. 4 of the last 12 years. Shelley Johansson, Keith Givolante, Glenn Lewis. I mean, you yourself.
We're going to forget somebody.
We're going to forget somebody. And so anybody that's listening, please forget.
I'm going to shut that down right now. So stop talking right now because there's more people will be left out.
Yeah. Core group of folks. I think some of it is, my point is they've been around the sport and they know what the racers are going through. Right. And so they know the pain, they know the suffering, they know the joy, they know the highs, they know the lows, they know all of the challenges, and they know what it takes to get them through the race, and they know that it's good volunteers. And I think that those people are so giving of themselves because they've been on the other side of it. You get a whole group of other folks that I think are more new to the sport and are more curious perhaps than anything else.
We had family members of racers. We had people who were local to Williamsport who had read about it in the newspaper and reached out. And they were just as critical to the team, played less of a leadership role, but did the slog work, right? Slept at a TA to make sure bike boxes didn't get tampered with, or at a staffed CP, they would spend 18 hours there just checking in racers and making sure, bikes were watched while racers went and ran off to a beautiful overlook. They did the grunt work too.
Yeah. Misty and Mike Garrison, 2 more that definitely deserve kind of that kind of individual shout out. But really, so many people that came out just for a day, just for a few hours, Last year at Clarion, I don't know if we had anyone this year like this. Last year at Clarion at the finish line, there were just these 4, frankly, random people from Clarion who had heard about the race, had no connection to adventure racing or Endless Mountains or anyone in the event. And they showed up and they stood down on the boat dock where everyone was taking out all night long. literally just to watch people's gear. I mean, so it's really amazing what people are willing to sign up for. I think being outdoors and seeing these people do amazing things is enough for most people.
I think you're right about that. I think that there are people who do it themselves recreationally and want to be witness to it, right? They want to help the other racer out. And I think that there's a subset of people who are generally curious about it. And I think that for anybody out there who's listening, the gateway to many an adventure racer is a volunteer experience, is to go out and find your local race director and talk a little bit about, what is like, how can I help out, and go help at registration, go help at a TA. There are many, many people out there I know who are curious, but they weren't ready to jump into a big race. But by being in that world, and along the way, they tend to bring people along with them. Clearly, there's a lot that has to take place inside of an adventure race for it to be successful. And you both can't do each other's jobs. And you mentioned strengths, you mentioned weaknesses before, Abby. So in a very rough sense of the word, when you look at what you both pick up and what you're good at, what are the things that your own natural skill set makes you good at in terms of organization and planning? Like what value do you bring to the partnership and to Rootstock Racing that you find is intrinsic to yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I do the lion's share of the coursework, but, we are talking about all of it. Right. So, I'm the one working with the maps. I tend to be the one doing 90% of the course scouting, which didn't used to be the case. Before we had kids, Abby and I would scout every course we designed together in its entirety. And then unfortunately, I mean, we love our kids, but, an unfortunate side effect of having a family is that we just can't find enough childcare to actually make that possible any longer. And because I am the lead navigator of our team and just I think I'm able to go out into the woods and do things a lot more effectively and faster. So I do all of that work, but we often talk about what kind of the goals are before I go out, right? So kind of the macro level course planning, and then I go out and do a lot of the micro work. And then we always talk about what I found out there, right? So, and I think that's kind of how we divide a lot of the work. So I also tend to do a lot of the design work.
Graphic design
in terms of kind of the swag and stuff like that. But it's the same kind of thing. Like I'll spend a lot of time on it, and then I'll run it by Abby usually too many times. She's like sick of me and is like, stop showing me, just go do it. Go send it to the t-shirt vendor. And I think it's kind of how our workflow is in general, right? We each have tasks that we will take on. We build a big spreadsheet, kind of like our to-do list at the start of the year, for this race at least. And, we kind of divide it up, and we all take primary responsibility for things, but we're constantly communicating about how things are going.
Yeah. So I'll do like pretty much all of the communication, most of the social media. I do almost all of our written material. So like the course book, Brent did the beautiful schematic and kind of all of the graphic charts and everything. But then I wrote the course descriptions, and I'll do the, racer communications, emails, those kinds of things. And I think, again, those are like drawing on our individual strengths, but then I'll send them over to Brent and he's like, oh, wait, you missed this really cool checkpoint in the way you were writing about that section. So let's add a note about, Heiner's hang gliding launch, for example. So even when we divide up discrete tasks, we're still probably over talking about them with each other.
I think what it boils down to the fact you have a natural skill set on your own, but then there's an overlap between each other where you act as each other's backup. You double check the work, right? And so it's almost like a Venn diagram where there are parts where you connect pretty strongly and parts where you don't connect that strongly, but that's just based upon what you're really good at. And I think that's an important message that if, I had the chance one time to interview a partnership, a race directing partnership. And during the course of the interview, which never made it to air, by the way, because the partnership kind of came apart at the seams, it was very clear that when they were talking, they attempted to be like, this is your silo, this is my silo. In my head, I was kind of like, that's not how this operates. And so in some ways, you kind of replicate your adventure racing experience as race directors, right? Because as an adventure racing team, you have to rely upon each other inside the team setting. You've transferred that to the race directing setting. And I think that's an important thing to realize, that if not for your strong partnership, that of course is always going to be friction in every partnership. I mean, welcome to the real world, right? It isn't always sunshine and roses. The fact that you work together and you were able to navigate those successfully is what makes it a good partnership. That's the way I see it.
We both have full-time demanding careers also outside of Rootstock. And so there are times of the year where my job is more consuming in times of the year where Brent's is. And so, in addition to skill sets, we also balance each other's calendars and make sure that one of us can be accountable pretty much all of the time.
And that's why it takes a year to put the race on.
Absolutely.
Right, because you just don't have the time, and so you have to begin the planning a year in advance. And it's interesting because it's we say a year, it's actually years, because you began to scope out this area years ago when you would take time out with your family to go look at all of that, and see that. And so we've mentioned like the we've mentioned various parts of the race, right? The sponsorships, the volunteers, how you two work together. Brent, what do you think?
Well, I was just going to say, I think one final point there, and we've had this conversation with some interested parties before, so just kind of sharing it publicly, like to your point about it's been years. I mean, it's really actually been more like 20 years, right? Or close to 20 years. I mean, I've been adventure racing, I think now for 17 or 18 years. And, we've had these conversations with some folks about like, what do we do to get to the point where we took on Endless Mountains? And we, to be honest, like to be clear, there's no right way to do this. Like you could have no experience in adventure racing and decide I want to put on an expedition race, and you have the right to do that, right? But my personal feeling, at least I think Abby would agree, is that to put on an event of this magnitude, right? You have to have been around for a while. And, so we've been competing in races for almost 20 years as racers at all levels, right? From the beginner level to quite experienced and quite competitive. We've traveled internationally. I think I've competed in 15 or so ARWS events at this point, 125 races total, whatever it might be, right? And I don't say any of that in I'm not trying to brag about that, but like we also are students of the sport, right? And so we are constantly learning from those experiences with an eye toward our race directing. We took our time getting here. We've been directing races for over a decade, both for Goals Adventure Racing Association first and now as Rootstock Racing. And I think we've really applied so much of that to this particular event. It's true of all of our races, but this one in particular, it literally has been years and years and years in the making, even if it wasn't necessarily a conscious plan for most of that time.
The idea of building base. Go ahead, Abby.
It's a blessing and a curse, right? And I imagine most other life partners who race together would experience the same thing. You draw on each other's energy and you feed off of it. But it becomes relatively consuming when adventure racing is such a part of each of your individual lives and then such a part of your relationship too. So the amount of time that we spend on adventure racing in our daily lives is probably embarrassing.
Yeah. I mean, this race is essentially a second full-time job. Mm-hmm. I mean,
that we share between the two of us.
Yeah. And when you combine the work that the two of us are doing, it's probably more than that. Now, some of that is like incredibly concentrated. So it's not necessarily that we're working on it every single day of every single week. But when you put it all together, it really does add up. Yeah.
So there's an old expression: if you want to make $1 million as a bike shop owner, start with $2 million. Right. And no one gets into adventure racing for the private jets and the villas in Nice. So putting aside that component first, why do you think it is that you and Abby are so dedicated to the sport in this manner? What do you take out of it? Much like the volunteers take something out of it, you have to take something out of it too.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question. After the race, I was talking to Jesse Tubb, who's, he's a teammate of ours. We've raced with him a fair bit as Rootstock Racing. He was racing for Bones Adventure Racing this year. And he was talking to me about the race. And he actually kind of described it to me as like basically kind of like art, right? And, I've been had for some reason been thinking about that a little bit and before. And, again, this could sound so off. Like I'm not like looking at what we're doing, like comparing ourselves to some like amazing professional artist. But, I think it has felt increasingly like an art project of sorts, one that we really put our hearts and souls into. We put an awful lot of attention to the smallest details. Like I spend tens of hours just working on bibs. right? Both the design of the bibs and the communication with bibs. And, it's an amazing amount of kind of like detailed work. And while it's sometimes frustrating, it's also incredibly rewarding to kind of complete each one of those steps, knowing that you're building this experience that 100 to 150 people are going to have. And that's ultimately what it's really about, for me at least, is watching these racers go through what they're going through, right? Through this journey. And that journey starts before the race, right? So it's not just about the course, but it's really about everything from once they've signed up through kind of the post-race. And it's just, I personally get an awful lot of satisfaction just kind of like living vicariously through them. I think I said this during the race, and I told people afterwards, like when you're racing, you have your experience, and to some degree, you have the experience of the 2-3 other people that you're racing with as a team. And especially in these big 5-day races, and we talk about how there's just so much emotion wrapped up in these 5 days of racing, right? Some people have said you live a year's worth of emotions in 5 days during an expedition race. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And then maybe you multiply that by 4 times, or 3 times when you're kind of racing with a team. And, this race, especially in a way more so than last year, I found myself just kind of like almost not feeling it fully all the time, but like watching these 110 people and then another 60 people with the light race, all having radically different experiences and knowing exactly what they're kind of going through, both from my experience, but also because I know what each step of that course looks like. And so that's both overwhelming. And I had some moments during the race this year where I was quite overwhelmed emotionally watching it unfold. But it also, the joy that people have when they finish is also something that I take away from it. So I don't know if you feel differently.
No, I think, this sounds really cheesy, but in some ways, like, this is our community. These are our people. And what a gift for us to kind of be able to create this and then have all of our friends come and like play in the woods, right? In some ways, this is like our ability to offer a love letter to the adventure racing community. And I know that sounds cheesy, but it really feels like that. Like, this is our way of expressing gratitude for how much we have gotten from this sport and from the people.
It's a super radical form of giving back to the sport.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
When I see super radical, I mean by that is the idea that it requires an incredible amount of everything, right? Of time and effort and resources. And, every moment you spend doing one thing, you could be doing another, right? So you're sacrificing one thing for another. So you choose not to do something in order to do this. But clearly many of us find that transaction is worth it. Right.
We get a ton out of it.
I say, when I tell people, by virtue of my profession working inside of schools, I have the chance to work with people about their future. I talk to young people about where they want to go. And I always tell them, keep at the end of your day, remember that the job that you're doing, you're exchanging a day of your life for it. That you're choosing to give up one thing in response to another. And I think that that's a valid point. And what you're saying is that for as much as you give back to make the race happen, you take as much out of it. And if not more, I bet if you would ask, I bet you would say that you probably get more out of it than you put into it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we have both said that in some ways race directing is more like personally gratifying than doing an expedition race. And I started there came a point where directing a 24-hour race wasn't quite as like emotionally satisfying. It was kind of like, okay, this is like, we're going through the motions, but like, I wasn't getting that same feeling of, oh, this is worth it. For the amount of work that it took. And you didn't feel this way. And Brent and I want to make it clear, like, our path has not always been totally parallel, right? There have been moments where each of us in different ways has said like, maybe I need to step back a little bit, or maybe this is too much, or maybe it's occupying too much space in our individual lives and in our collective life. But when we stepped into doing the 5-day race, I felt that come back in like such deep and consuming ways. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I more just to what you just said. I think I would just also say that I think a big thing that shifted was when Abby found herself at home more during the planning process. right? So like, I mean, I'm speculating.
No, I think that's true.
But I think with like 24-hour length races or such, but when I talk about being able to envision what people are going through every step of the way, Abby can't do that. She's not out in the woods with me doing the scouting. She doesn't know what checkpoint 22 looks like. 22 is one that gave, probably 80%.
A lot of people don't know what it looks like either.
Yeah.
It's not just Abby.
Yeah. But that is one of the things for me that has been constant throughout our journey. Not that it's always been easy for me either. I've had my moments of challenges as a race director. I think all race directors have those kind of like, darker moments of just wondering like, why are they doing it? And it's so much time that we put into it and so much energy, and so much fear, honestly. Like there's a lot of fear directing these races, but there's always that satisfaction. And as to Abby's first point, like I'm at a point where, and I've been at this point for a while, where I absolutely get, frankly, a lot more out of this side of adventure racing than I do as a racer at this point. And not to say I don't get an awful lot as a racer, but this is something different.
So I've heard that the putting a race of this magnitude down, the phrase of this magnitude is good. They call it a high wire act. That there's a lot of moving pieces at once, right? And you tip the domino on the race and you put 35 teams on the course, and for the next 120 hours, right? And usually around 95 for the winners, but 120 hours, those teams are going to have to travel a course that you created a world, and you're responsible for them inside that world. How many checkpoints were on the course?
I think
was it over 100? When you add it all up, it's over 100.
So according to the tracker, there were 107 for a full course, not including transition areas and not including
all the individual ropes points.
The small checkpoints at the rope section, of which there were an additional 10. So we could call it 107, call it 117, whatever you like. Yeah.
So you had to find 117 places where people had to get to. Now, not everybody goes full course. We know that, but that's kind of high wire, right? I have to put 117 spots out there in the universe that have to be accurate to a piece of paper that we're handing them. And how many maps were racers handed?
Sorry, what was that?
How many maps were they handed?
I think they were somewhere high 20s.
I had 23 in my head, but that might not be quite right.
I thought it was like 27 or 28. I have to double check that. But
the supplemental. Always use your supplemental. 27 maps.
Not including supplementals. Yeah.
So let's say around 30 maps used to find roughly about 117 checkpoints over the course of how many stages?
There were 8 stages this year. Yeah.
And how did those stages break out in terms of paddling, trekking, mountain biking, and climbing?
So 2 were paddling, 2 were trekking. The other 4 were biking, but there were 2 embedded trekking sections within the big bike.
They had to get off their bike, leave their bike there, go in the woods, get back on their bike, and keep going.
Stage B, which we really technically said was just one stage of the race, it was a big bike with these embedded loops, was really actually more like 5 stages, right? There was a bike stage, a trekking stage, another bike stage, trekking and ropes, and then a final bike stage to the TA. It was a unique challenge for the racers, I think. I think a lot found that stage to be incredibly challenging. And I think a big part of that challenge was the way teams mentally approached it. Yeah, I agree with that.
Stage for the staff and volunteers.
And it was very challenging for us the first 2 days. Yeah.
I was a witness to that. About 13 hours into the race, I had the chance. You mentioned earlier, I was embedded. I took on the sacrifice of going to a hotel while the rest of you were out in the woods. And we were at Penwell's Hotel, and Sean Bryant and his family, who just were outstanding.
One rainy night of the race, too.
Rainy night. They were pouring rain, and we were under the awning. Thank God for that. The funny part was that we had actually set up the interview area for the dark zone inside the hotel. I took a photo, and someone saw the photo and said, "Brian, you're an idiot. They're going to destroy that hotel. Racers and mud and laying." I guess we moved outside, and racers not allowed in the hotel. There was a water spigot there. Worked out great, and that was fantastic. But I was amazed that I saw them like 13 hours into the race, between 13 and roughly 20 or so hours into the race, and how smoked they were that early in the race. And I think they just had a really hard, the heat of the day, the pre-race jitters, 13 hours. I pointed out to one person, I said, well, 13 hours in, you have 107 hours to go. How's it feeling? And he's like, don't say it that way. Like, don't, you're not helping us out.
Yeah, there was such a constellation of circumstances that created that level of depletion, I think, so early in the race. We started on the water. It was incredibly hot and humid and sunny, and people kind of got baked.
It was windy
and then
as well.
the wind kicked up, so they weren't able to eat and drink because they were just battling the headwind. And then soon after they got on their bikes, the rain started. And so it was just this like cycle of changing conditions that people had to grapple with, in addition to the monumental task of imagining being out there for 5 days, which I've always said the hardest night of an expedition race is night one, because you're going through, most of the time you're not sleeping, and you're like, holy cow, how can I keep doing this?
I got this portrait ahead of me.
Most sustainable.
And for the folks out there planning for the media, when we decided to do so there was a 5-minute mandatory media stop for every team during the race. And we were fortunate that it happened on that night, going into the 13 hours into the race. It was the first night of the race. At first, I was concerned that doing it then was going to be too soon in the race, that there was not going to be enough to talk about at that point. I was quickly proven wrong because the race delivered and gave a lot to talk about. And later on in the race, it would not have been workable because the tail of the race had gotten so long that to talk to every single racer, there was so much spread between the first team and the team that was at the back of the field that it would have been 30 hours sitting in one spot. But I do think that from a media perspective and a podcasting perspective, having that embedded media stop and then being able to cull that into an hour and 40-minute broadcast was really a very powerful thing to do. When you look at the metrics that came out of the Endless Mountains, it's the most popular by a mile of the different people. Really enjoyed hearing that. Shout out to Brian Menard, and Brian Menard is on team. Is it Wolf Howlers? Moon Howlers.
Moon Howlers. Yeah.
Moon Howlers. I spoke to Ryan after the race. Between the wind and the trucks, there was one interview that could not make it to the final. It was Brian and Blair at Blair Bingham, who just, if they deserved to have a chance to be heard, it was them. And I went and I worked on that piece and I edited it, and it was just, I couldn't do it. So Brian and Blair, I know you're out there, and I you're the only one we couldn't get to. So, you got to come back and race next time, and I'll make certain we get good sound for that one. There was a question that I asked. I asked pretty much every team the same question when we were at the hotel. And the question was this, and I want to ask it to the two of you. And I want you to, I almost want to have you leave the room and answer. I'm not going to do that to you. I think we'll keep you guys together. But Abby, we're going to start with you for the answer for this one, because I want to give you a shot at it first. In the planning of the race itself and all that leads up to it, and reading about it and talking about it and planning it, there's the race that you think you're going to have. And then there's the race that you are having, or the race that you had. So when you look back on the Endless Mountains 2023 and you think about what you did and what you didn't do, how do those two things compare? How you thought it was going to go versus how it went?
That's a really good question. And I think if you had asked me at the Penwells Hotel 13 hours into the race, my answer would have been different than it is now. As I said earlier, I don't think we appreciated how logistically ambitious the course was, and especially how logistically ambitious the first 30 hours was, because we were running the 30-hour race alongside it, because Brent ended up being in the woods for the better part of 24 hours because he wanted to be on site at the ropes, just in case, anything went wrong. And either of us could have done that, but he felt strongly that as somebody who has wilderness first responder training, he wanted to be on site there. And I ended up being kind of the point person for both races and for our 4-year-old who was on site for those entire 30 hours almost. And I got to the end of that and was about as fried as I've ever been during a moment of race directing, in 13 years of doing it. And so that was not how I envisioned the race going in, but it actually should have been predictable if we had really thought about it. And it got better from there. And also we gave over some control to our volunteer staff, which made a really big difference, I think, for the two of us. By the end of the race, we kind of gave over the reins to some of the transportation logistics and some of the TA management. in a way that we hadn't set it up to be able to do at the beginning. But we together with this team of volunteers was able to kind of put things in place that needed to happen. And we had a great debrief with that group of people afterward to think about how we can do that in advance next time. So that's an extended answer to your question, but I think the logistical complexity of the first 30 hours. Luckily, that was the first 30 hours, because if it had been the last 30 hours, I don't know that I would be involved in doing another Endless Mountains.
and for the race director out there, what made it so logistically complex? Like, what was the thing that if you it worked out fine and the race went well and folks who were fried were unfried eventually and all's well that ended well. But looking back on it, would you have done it that same way, or would you have changed something inside that section? Or did it was just the way the race unfolded, the way the racers fell out? You had one team that had a big lead and everybody else, you had to think about them. Like, they were playing a role. Ben Racing, to their credit, had a very successful race. You had teams that were all spread out. You had Team Hoodis, who's personally Dark Zone favorite race of the team of the entire race. They were towards the back. Was it the tail of the race that caused that challenge?
No, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
By the 30-hour mark, the field, relative to what it became, was not as spread out as it wasn't that impactful. I think we had 2 teams lose a member in the first 15 hours of the race, and we had to figure out the logistics of getting them back to Williamsport. We also had 2 light teams, I believe, retire from the course.
I think it was more than that.
It may have been more than 2. We had gear that had to be moved for both races. So we had kind of trucks moving the 5-day race gear through multiple TAs, and then also moving the 30-hour gear through different TAs and some of the same TAs. We had to have 2 teams of volunteers at each TA. And then, as Brent said, we had these 2 embedded sections, but that required 3 teams of volunteers because of the way they were set up. And then there were 2 other staffed checkpoints in those first 30 hours. So there was
I'm confused just hearing it.
Right.
I can only imagine what it was like actually on site at night, like making it all happen.
So I think if we were to do it again, I might try to make the first day of the race a little bit more manageable logistically if we were going to run both races. But the way we set up the course, I think that the logistics were inevitable. The stress may have been mitigated by a little bit more of forethought on our parts. But
yeah, I'm not sure. Abby and I don't agree on everything. I don't know that I really think we could have avoided it. I think we both said out loud to ourselves and then to the volunteer crew beforehand, the first 30 hours is going to be really hard. And then it should settle. And I think it took more like 40 hours probably to settle, honestly. So it was like a little bit longer. I think the thing that we probably, and I don't know how exactly we would have avoided it, but I think, as Abby alluded to, like, we ended up in a situation where our normal kind of division and balance of labor between the 2 of us was kind of pushed aside because I was in at the rope site. And, as Abby alluded to, I felt relatively strongly about that from a safety management standpoint more than anything else. I kind of felt like an ownership of that. And the reality was I was there by myself for most of that stretch, which allowed us to have volunteers elsewhere. Because otherwise, if that was a job I felt like I could do with the ropes guides we had hired. But if it wasn't me, if it was people that were, not familiar with the site themselves or not medically trained, we probably would have had to have 2 or 3 people in there. I think it was just, it's just those extra checkpoints, right? I mean, I think we had, at the end of day 2, we had a moment where we had 3 transition areas open. For part of that time, we had the light finish line open, and we had 3 manned checkpoints open as well. So we ended up with a situation where I think we had like 7 different staffed locations open. And that doesn't account for the fact that we also had to be kind of like figuring out this incredibly elaborate puzzle of moving gear around for 2 totally different races at that point. It was just that was a lot. But back to your earlier questions, right? Like, the staff were just amazing. So, like with one of our man checkpoints, Dave Powers sat there for like 20 hours, maybe longer. I don't know.
He was great. What do you hear of that guy? Holy
checking
cow.
people in. And it was at 6:30 in the morning at the ropes. We were probably only halfway done at the rope site. I'd been there since 10 the night before. The head guide, Chad from Crooked Creek Campground and Crooked Roots Adventures, comes up to me and says, so I think two of my guys are going to be taking off around 9 or 9:30 in the morning. And I'm like, oh, okay. So like I'm getting prepared to potentially belay myself. And instead we put out a call, and Keith and Ken Money from Michigan rolled in, and they belayed for like 6 hours. And, but again, that removed two people that were supposed to be helping kind of with the rest of the race. So I don't know. Like we talked about the reality that we were going to have to figure it out to some degree on the fly, because that's adventure racing and that's also adventure race directing. And I don't know that we could have done a whole lot better.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was. I remember my own memory is going from the beginning of the race to Penn Wells and editing that edition of Dark Zone. I was awake for like 37 hours, and editing that piece at like hour 36. When I published that piece, I literally published it and went to sleep. I woke up in the morning and I'm like, did I actually put a podcast out last night? Like I had to check my phone, and I was like, I actually did. And nobody was flipping out in the universe about it. No one was like, what do you, so it worked out well, but like sitting there and trying to edit it. So the high wire act was for a lot of people going that. And I think to your point, someone who had observed it and someone who had lived it, I think in many ways, I think it was just going to be what it was going to be. Right. And it was going to unfold the way it unfolded. And to your point about the ropes and all the logistics, all the movement, like anybody who volunteers at a 5-day adventure race, you know what you're getting yourself into. Right. And you're going to be, like you mentioned, Dave Powers doing 20 hours in that one section. I mean, Dave couldn't do enough for the race. I mean, talking about the guy that just stepped up in a huge way. And that's what you agree to do. Right. And so I agree there. But it did smooth out after those stages. And I think that when you discussed the idea of giving over some of the control to some of the more experienced volunteers, it cleared things up on your end a little bit too. And then eventually the race is just flowing. Like the hard part of the race is behind you, and then people are just all about the course. And then you're dealing with like a food truck possibly being late, or or getting special food dietary restrictions at a local supermarket at 8 a.m. Like those kinds of things you do, and it all wraps up. But Brent, I'm not letting you off the hook though. You have to answer the question. The race that you thought you were going to have versus the race you had.
I might cheat a little bit, to be honest with you here, but I'll give you a quick technical answer. I think the one that I would just say is like, I think it's just like you come up with these elaborate plans for how you're going to move your volunteers around, and inevitably that doesn't work. Right. And like someone really needs to sleep. Right. Or someone, just kind of is there for daytimes, but not nighttimes. And you didn't fully account for that. And, we're not going to make anyone go out there and like suffer. Right. So I think that's the hardest part. And it's just like you get surprised by those things and you have to shift. I actually personally felt like the race went more or less according to plan. I think, of course, we had a few teams in that first 24 hours that had issues, and more than I would have liked to have, but like it happens, right? And most of those things were heat related, or there was a bike crash. Someone had a kind of like a pre-existing health condition thing that flared up, unfortunately, on them. And, those things happen. You obviously hope to minimize that, but nothing huge and nothing major. And after that first day, it generally really settled down. So that was all good. No, your question makes me actually think really more about scouting. Right. And, so going back to that kind of like topic, which we danced around a little bit, like, I spent a lot of time out in the woods, and every time I go out in the woods, I have a plan, and I know, and Abby and I always say, like, that's not what you're going to end up doing. And despite the fact that, I've had that experience now with probably 30 or 40 races directed, it never ceases to amaze me how I go out to the woods with this grand plan to get X, Y, and Z done, and I sometimes don't even get X done.
He's like, I'll see you Saturday for dinner. I'm like, yeah, I'll see you Monday morning.
Yeah. Yeah. Or it's
hey,
like,
Chad, I'm coming in, make up the bed. Crooked Creek, I'm inbound.
And I think one more weekend will do it, and it's 4 weekends, right? That's just it. Like, nothing specific there, but there's like, that's the hardest part for me in a way, especially at this point of race directing, is just the grind of the scouting part, which is just, it's a lot. Yeah.
So what's the future for the Endless Mountains?
We have a tentative date set for the next one, which will be the week of June 23rd, 2025. We've alluded to us both having other professional lives, but we both work in education. I'm a college professor and Brent's a high school teacher. And so we are at the whim of the academic calendar and can only direct multi-day races during the summer. So that's actually the first week we can do it. We are not announcing a location yet, but we are actively working on that, and hopefully we'll be able to announce sooner than later.
So that's 2 years from now.
2 years.
2 years
yeah.
from now. And is the 2 year break a common thing to carry in adventure racing for a 5-day race?
I'd say it's like a 50-50. I think a number of races do it that way. Some for whatever reason do it every year. I think our philosophy on it is, first of all, just for our ability to keep doing this in a sustainable way, we can't do it every year. I think we also, as racers, know that, a lot of racers that are active in the expedition circuit, they don't want to do the same race every year. Like, we would love to have people come back and do, all 4 or 5 of the Endless Mountains races we have planned in the PA Wilds. Realistically, like, I would be surprised if that final number ends up being more than 5 to 10 people. Like, people have other things they want to do.
Well, but to your credit, though, you did share before the race, what percentage of people return from 22 to 23?
Yeah, depending on how you calculate it, whether it's the team name or the actual racer, it's between 70 and 80%. Which
So that's almost 4/5. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was like 70-ish people, right, that have done both of the additions, but still, right?
But
like,
to your point, year after year after year would get challenging. I got you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And like, people that, part of the goal of Endless Mountains is like, we want to get more people into expedition racing, and we want people to level up. Pennsylvania is amazing. We love it. We really think it's as we've said time and time again now, we think it's a underappreciated outdoor kind of playground in North America that most people have no idea about. But I also get why people are drawn toward the Cascades and Expedition Oregon, or, British Columbia and Expedition Canada, or, the race down in the Ozarks. Or for a smaller number of teams, they want to get on a plane and they want to go over to Europe. They want to go to Africa. They want to go do, a much more, let's just say, like a sexier race, right? Like someplace that's got a little bit more of that, like, allure and magic to it, which we get.
And we've made those decisions ourselves. And
we do too. So like, I think the every other year model makes it a little easier for folks to actually get out there and try different things and then hopefully come back. Like, I think we feel very strongly we offer something, unique as expedition races go. And we think we, again, we've been doing this for a long time and have put a lot of thought into our races. So we think there's an experience here for folks. But I did want to add one little additional teaser, again, without giving kind of details, but I think our vision for Endless has evolved a bit. So the original vision really was, 4 or 5 races in the Pennsylvania Wilds, and then we'll see, right? I think what we're pondering is, don't write this in stone, but maybe more something like a 2 out of 3 year model. I'm not sure we fully agree on that yet, but it's an idea where one of the 2 would be in Pennsylvania, but that we're going to explore the idea of directing Endless outside of Pennsylvania as well. And so we've got 3 or 4 spots that we've talked about potentially looking at, and we're excited about all of them. They have unique challenges and benefits, and we're just trying to figure out whether that's going to be 2025 or we're going to wait a little longer on taking it outside of Pennsylvania.
And working with, as we talked about earlier, working with ARWS and making sure it aligns with their calendar and the geography of the way races are going to move around North America over the next several years.
Right, because there's an audience size limit, and there's like right now, I mean, there's a bit of our cup runneth over, right? We had the demonstration race down in Ozark. We had Endless Mountains. You have Bend Racing, obviously, does America's Toughest Race, and then you have Expedition Canada, right? And so those are 4 5-day races that occur in the area. What else, Abby, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so we would be remiss if we didn't thank ARWS for really being an ambassador to the sport internationally and connecting us with a number of brands that ended up becoming race partners, including Moose Jaw, Garmin, Squirt Cycling, and Lubanzi Wine, out of South Africa. They actually sent a can of wine for each person competing in the 5-day race, prizes for the 30-hour race, and bubbly to spray for the top 3 teams in the 5-day race as well.
What a sport that wine will travel across international time zones to be given out in Pennsylvania race. Beautiful stuff. Well done, South Africa.
And the bibs people were produced in South Africa. So there you go. Yeah. But Brian, I did want to also just say, because you noted kind of working with the other ARWS race directors, right? I think it's also just important to recognize, while we sometimes in these conversations focus on 3 or 4 events, there's dozens of other events happening, right, in the North American racing circuit between the United States and Canada and to Mexico as well. Like our hope of directing outside of Pennsylvania comes with a huge caveat, right? Like we feel very strongly that we are going to have conversations with local race directors and the local racing community in these other states before we actually move ahead, So we actually have a meeting scheduled with someone shortly to talk about kind of one of our out-of-state options. And if we can't figure out something that works for the local race scene up there, like it's not going to happen. I think the family is much bigger than just the expedition races. And maybe we're like, it's a bigger event, but it's not necessarily that it's more important than a 12 or 24-hour race at a regional level.
Well, I think that you realize a point there too, is that the small, somewhat insular nature of adventure racing and adventure race directing means that we have to play together nice in the sandbox, and that it would be inappropriate and impolite to go crashing into another region's race calendar without having a sense of humility and saying, listen, we'd like to talk to you about this and can we able to have a conversation about it, as opposed to just showing up and announcing your race there. It's impolite to do it that way. Yeah. And you wouldn't do that.
No. And, a few years ago, someone, I actually don't know if the event ended up happening, but someone popped up into Pennsylvania and kind of threw together a race, or was talking about throwing together a race. And it didn't feel good, right? Like it didn't feel good not to have the conversation. And, at the end of the day, I'm sure no one would have said no. I think this was back in the days when we were still working with Goals Adventure Racing Association. But yeah, like we're a big family, and we should really be working and coordinating together, I think, on these kinds of events.
Brian, should we tease the one that we keep talking about that's like 10 years in the making at this point?
Go for it.
So our ambitions to create an expedition race stem from, 2009, a conversation at Rodney Valello and Amy Bartoletti's Longest Day, where we talked about designing a race that went from New York City to Philadelphia. And that obviously never emerged, but it's still like, in the back of my head is, could we ever pull it off? And, we've talked to you about it. We've continued to talk to Rodney and Amy about it. Rodney and Amy, again, of the New York Adventure Racing Association. It
would be the greatest race in history of adventure racing. After that, shut it down. Nothing else could possibly replace it.
The final Endless Mountains.
The final checkpoint is climbing the tallest building in downtown Philadelphia. That's you're going to punch the final checkpoint.
I was going to say, maybe when we're 70 and ready to hang it up, and it's a little easier to hang a checkpoint from an elevator under a bridge overpass.
Exactly. You're no longer going in the woods. But I think that point, I mean, we all have, when you do adventure racing, you kind of live in a world in which you think about like possibility. Right? Like you dreamed up the Endless Mountains as a couple, and you talked about it and you made it happen, right? You brought it to fruition. And there are other races out there. I know that the guys outside of Western National Chain they're putting their first race on out there, right? So there's all these aspiring race directors that are putting these races on of 6, 12, 14, 18, 20 hours, 36 hours, whatever it is, all the way to 5 days. And I think they keep doing that because they love bringing that to the people, to the crowd. Like people really, and we mentioned before about sounding cheesy and kind of, feeling kind of trite, but I absolutely am amazed. And we saw it time and time again in Endless Mountains. Like go back and look at the finish line photos. There are people on that course who, when they started that race, they didn't know if they could do it, and they did it. And that's an incredibly life-changing event that people have. And I think those of us who do a lot of racing and those of us who talk a lot about racing, I think we lose a sense of perspective. We get a little myopic. We forget how big a deal this is to people.
Yeah. Someone, it might have been you, I can't remember. Someone, I think on day 2 or day 3 asked me like, so, who gives you more satisfaction or something? Who do you enjoy watching more, right? Like the top teams duking it out, right? Or the other teams, right? And, Abby made the point earlier, like part of the reason we love doing this is to give our community and our friends this experience. And probably 60 or 70% of the racers here, maybe more, like we know quite well, but there's a smaller number of them that we either kind of know in passing or don't know because they're out for the first time. Watching these teams, looking kind of at the results, right? Watching Hoodis, who you've mentioned quite a bit, right? Moon Howlers has been around forever, but they're this, Brian was at our race last year, and I know he wasn't thrilled with the way his race or his team's race went. This year they lost a teammate on night one due to a bike crash, and he and Blair just kept a smile on, and I think from his perspective, it's like every year gets better, right? You do a little bit more each year.
Blue Bolt Rock Hop,
Blue Bolt Rock Hop, first race, bipolar, for Kate Matthews. It was her first big race. Epic Nap.
I'll pause there real quickly. We'll come back to Kate in a second. So not only did Kate do the race, but her husband, Jim Mernon, helped set up the finish line. There was a couch there, inflatable couches for people, and there was rug, and we had a tracker. Jimmy made pizzas for everybody as they came across the line, brought his own pizza oven. But we have to note that after Kate finished the race, she went back, she took a nap, and she came out with her bum shoulder, and she was making and serving pizzas. So she had that Venn diagram of racer and volunteer, that rarely touched holy grail, if you will, of being adventure race, the amazingness there.
But Epic Nav was another team. This amazing story. It was this team of 3 folks that literally came together in the last 3 to 4 weeks before the race. And then one of them couldn't come. One of them couldn't race. And the other 2 had basically never met each other. And they started the race. And
they only knew Sunday night that they were racing as a field. Yeah. So they even had to figure out their gear.
Amazing.
Just amazing, right? But Ubuntu had at least a couple folks on that team who were in their first time. I think Uphill Both Ways, a Canadian team who we'd never met, were doing their first multi-day race. I think the rest of Trust the Compass had 2 guys, 2 of our friends from kind of the Mid-Atlantic who kind of have been cutting their teeth at rootstock races since the beginning of rootstock, and they took on their first big one. A special shout out probably to 3 Rock, who were these 2 guys doing their first big race. I know that they were nervous before the event, kind of asking those questions. I think you asked this question years ago, I think of James Thurlow, right? Of, is this race for me? Right. Mm-hmm. And, I know they kind of reflected publicly about kind of the nerves they were feeling, wondering if they should be there, and just running an amazing race.
And the cool thing there was they went out before the race. They had dinner with Jim Roundsley, who flew over for the race, right? He was here. Jim Roundsley gave them advice during the race, and they actually showed him their kit and said, we changed our bin selection due to you during the race. And Jim Roundsley was amazed that they had listened to him. Actually, who wants to listen to Jim Roundsley? Had listened to Jim and then went and actually, changed their race because of him.
Yeah. Well, and I got an email from those guys after the race saying they're now thinking about Iterra because of Jim.
Yeah. So. But, watching those teams, and a lot of those teams are people we don't know. A couple of them have people we know quite well, but most of them are new to us. And just watching their journey from the start line to the finish line is just the most amazing thing. It's fun watching Ben and Bones and Rib and Penticton and No Complaints battle it out up top, but we kind of
you should say No Complaints had one person on the team who was an expedition race newbie, Brandon Hopkins.
True, right? That's true, and I'm sure there are a few other teams. I think didn't Solomon?
Oh, Solomon and Gastodi. It was his first expedition race.
So it's not just exactly, but just amazing watching that, right? Really amazing.
Yeah, and the all inside 120 hours, but it's not. It's 10 years, it's 15 years, it's a year's worth of planning. It's talking to sponsors, it's talking to volunteers, it's doing the scouting, right? It's the designing things, it's logistical, it's the writing, it's the media, it's the photography, it's all those pieces come together to create this world that exists for a finite amount of time, but then exists long after it. I always think about the first time racer who goes to work like the week after. What'd you do during the week off? And no one believes them.
Yeah.
They're like, you did what? For how long? Yeah. The question is, where did you sleep? That's always the question. Well, I didn't a whole lot. Well, okay, but you're right, and we create that, and I think that it's a blessing and an honor to get to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, is there anything that was left unsaid that we want to be thoughtful about you and your family time? And it's starting to get dark there, so the wee ones have to go to sleep soon. But is there anything that you wanted to highlight that you didn't highlight? The question I didn't ask.
I don't know. I mean, nothing's coming to mind. I'm always happy to talk shop. I guess I would just end with a thank you. I think I would just thank anyone that's listening that was part of the event, however you were part of it. You showed up and you raced, you showed up and volunteered, you cheered for the racers on the sideline.
Dot watched at home.
Dot watching at home. You happen to be a partner or a sponsor who helped us behind the scenes get the race to the start line.
Partner who let their partner race and kind of have that experience, and you stayed home and held down the shop.
But we really do genuinely appreciate and thank everybody for choosing Endless Mountains. There's so many other events to choose from, and people have busy lives, and it takes an awful lot to sign up for these things. A lot of resources, both financial, but also time and energy and emotional resources to get yourself through this race. And as Abby said, that's especially true for people's families who are also along for the ride, often from home. And just thank everybody for being part of it and for trusting us with your time. And we definitely are hoping that a lot of people will come back again, whether it's in Pennsylvania next time or somewhere else.
Well, there you have it, folks. Dark Zone number 76. Thanks to Brent and Abby for their honest and thoughtful comments. Special thanks to everybody who raced the Endless Mountains. So many teams were called out. So many good memories and stories. We appreciate you listeners for being here. Thanks for being part of the Dark Zone. Keep racing and keep training. Go get them. And thank you again to our charity partner, Ascend Athletics, for all that you bring to young women in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are proud to support your mission of developing leadership and community service in that part of the world. Listeners, thanks for being here. You have a lot of choice in how you spend your time, and we're grateful that you choose to spend it with the Dark Zone. To help us out, go like our Facebook page and head over to your platform of choice and rate, click, and like. Their algorithm likes that when people pay attention to podcasts. Spread the word. Thanks for being here, and good luck racing and have fun training.